There is a comforting story we like to tell ourselves about cruelty. It goes something like this. People are basically good. When someone causes harm, it must be because they were first hurt. If we dig deep enough into their childhood, their trauma, their suffering, we will find the explanation, and perhaps even the excuse. This story is emotionally appealing. It allows us to preserve a hopeful image of humanity. It allows us to believe that cruelty is an accident rather than a choice, a wound rather than a weapon. Peter Salerno's Cruelty by Nature is an attempt to dismantle that story. Not with rage, not with moral panic, but with an uncomfortable proposition. Some people cause harm, not because they are broken, but because cruelty itself is part of how they function. This is not a book about monsters. It is a book about ordinary people who repeatedly, deliberately, and unknowingly harm others, and about the cultural myths that prevent us from naming that reality. Salerno's core argument is simple, and that simplicity is precisely what makes it disturbing. Cruelty does not always arise from trauma. Cruelty is not always a misunderstanding. Cruelty is sometimes intentional, patterned, and internally rewarding. This immediately places the book in quiet opposition to much of modern pop psychology, which tends to frame abusive behavior almost exclusively as a downstream effect of suffering. In Salerno's view, this framework has produced a dangerous blind spot. By over-pathologizing cruelty as damage, we fail to recognize agency, pattern, and preference in abusive individuals. The result is not compassion, it is confusion, and that confusion is paid for by victims. One of the book's most important contributions is its insistence on a distinction many people instinctively resist. Harm is not the same thing as cruelty. People can harm others accidentally. People can harm others out of fear, ignorance, or desperation. People can harm others while feeling genuine remorse. Cruelty, as Salerno defines it, is something else entirely. Cruelty involves awareness of the harm being caused, repetition of the harm across contexts, indifference to the suffering of the target, or more disturbingly, gratification derived from that suffering. This distinction matters because modern discourse tends to flatten all wrongdoing into a single moral category. Once everything is labeled trauma response, the concept of intent quietly disappears. Salerno argues that cruelty, properly understood, requires intent, even if that intent is unconscious, habitual, or emotionally muted. A recurring theme throughout the book is what might be called the myth of universal empathy, the belief that all humans are wired at baseline to care about others in roughly the same way. Salerno challenges this assumption directly. Drawing on neuroscience, personality research, and clinical experience, he describes a subset of individuals for whom empathy is selectively absent, cognitively simulated but not emotionally felt, or overridden by dominance, entitlement, or reward circuitry. Importantly, he does not frame these people as inhuman. He frames them as human in a different configuration. This is an uncomfortable framing because it removes the reassuring boundary between us and them. If cruelty is not a deviation from humanity, but a variance within it, then moral clarity becomes harder, not easier. But Salerno insists that denying this variability does not make us kinder, it makes us vulnerable. Much of Cruelty by Nature focuses on individuals with severe personality pathology, particularly narcissistic, psychopathic, and antisocial traits. However, Salerno is careful to avoid two common errors, equating diagnosis with destiny, using labels as moral laws. Instead, he emphasizes patterns of behavior over labels. Cruelty, in his framework, reveals itself not through a single act, but through repeated boundary violations, consistent exploitation, strategic manipulation, absence of accountability, and a tendency to interpret harm as deserved. One of the book's most controversial positions is its critique of trauma-centered explanations for abuse. Salerno does not deny that trauma exists. He does not deny that trauma can distort behavior. He does not deny that many abusers were once victims. What he denies is the leap from was harmed to therefore harms. He presents evidence that many people experience severe trauma without becoming abusive. Some chronically abusive individuals report relatively ordinary childhoods. Cruelty often persists even after therapeutic intervention and insight. This last point is particularly unsettling. Therapy, Salerno notes, can sometimes increase an abuser's effectiveness by giving them language, credibility, and psychological insight without altering their moral orientation. One of the book's strengths is its refusal to sensationalize cruelty. Salerno does not describe abusers as sadistic caricatures. Instead, he depicts cruelty as mundane, procedural, sometimes boring. Cruelty often looks like calmly denying reality, quietly shifting blame, subtly isolating someone from support, repeatedly crossing lines while feigning confusion. This understated depiction is perhaps more disturbing than overt violence. It suggests that cruelty does not require rage or hatred, only indifference combined with entitlement. Cruelty, in this sense, is not an emotional explosion. It is a workflow. A major ethical concern addressed by the book is the disproportionate burden placed on victims to understand their abusers. Victims are often encouraged to empathize, contextualize, forgive, remain patient, avoid stigmatizing language. Salerno argues that this cultural script effectively recruits victims into the psychological maintenance of their own harm. Understanding, he insists, should never be a prerequisite for safety. Clarity is not cruelty. Naming abuse is not an act of hatred, it is an act of self-preservation. A potential criticism of cruelty by nature is that it risks sliding into biological determinism, the idea that cruel people are simply wired wrong. Salerno anticipates this critique and repeatedly emphasizes that predisposition is not permission. Acknowledging biological or personality-based risk does not remove responsibility. On the contrary, it strengthens the case for boundaries and informed caution. In this sense, the book advocates for ethical realism rather than pessimism. It does not claim that cruel people cannot change, only that change cannot be assumed, demanded from victims, or substituted for accountability. One of the most important aspects of the book is its challenge to moral symmetry, the idea that in every conflict both sides are equally responsible. Salerno argues that cruelty introduces moral asymmetry. When one party repeatedly exploits, manipulates, or harms, neutrality becomes complicity. This is deeply countercultural in an era obsessed with balance and nuance, but Salerno insists that nuance without discernment is not wisdom, it is abdication. Clear distinction between harm and cruelty. Refusal to romanticize trauma. Pattern-based analysis rather than sensationalism. Strong advocacy for victim clarity and boundaries. Calm clinical tone that avoids hysteria. A fair review must acknowledge potential weaknesses. Some readers may find the book emotionally austere. Salerno's restraint can feel cold, especially to those who want explicit moral condemnation. Others may worry that the book underestimates the possibility of change in individuals with severe personality pathology, and some may feel that its framework risks being misused by people seeking to label rather than understand. These are valid concerns, but they are not arguments against the book's core thesis, only reminders that truth requires careful handling. Cruelty by nature is not a comforting book. It does not promise that love will heal all wounds. It does not insist that understanding will redeem all harm. It does not reassure us that evil is rare or obvious. Instead, it offers something quieter and more difficult. Clarity. In the spirit of truth, it suggests that compassion without discernment is not kindness, it is self-erasure. And perhaps the most unsettling implication of this book is this: if cruelty can be natural, then goodness is not guaranteed. It is a choice, repeated, maintained, and defended, sometimes against those who would exploit it.